So the first challenge we decided to tackle was how do you assess reading skills when you can no longer sit in a small room and deliver individually administered, expertly scored assessments to kids. So that was the birth of Roar. The idea was, can we build, gamified web apps that tap into the mechanisms we know that are involved in reading, and make those scalable and automated.
Got me diagnosed when I was in third grade. And it was the most relieving day of my life because I finally had kind of a place to hang my hat and say, see, I told you, I'm not lazy, definitely not stupid. I just learned differently, and that's totally okay.
We dyslexics, we were often, just set up for failure because, we were given books and tasks that really are not appropriate for the level that we were at.
So how do you expect anyone to be open to learning when their entire relationship with reading, with learning, is physical pain?
Wish I had understood when I was younger that the fact that my brain worked differently than people meant that I would be good at things in ways that other kids were not going to be good at.
I just assumed I can't be dyslexic because letters don't jump up and down for me.
Dyslexia is not a disorder. It is not a disease.
Once you sort of own it and embrace it, then you can have the power to deal with it. It's sort of empowering and also enriching to the whole community.
To those who don't understand what dyslexia is, that it's not a negative, it's not a problem, it's like we keep saying superpower.
Hey everyone, we are Sonia and Nick, and this is Dyslexia Journey. And today we are excited to welcome Professor Jason Yeatman. Dr. Jason Yeatman is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Education and Department of Psychology at Stanford University and the Division of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics at Stanford University School of Medicine. Dr. Yeatman completed his PhD in psychology at Stanford, where he studied the neurobiology of literacy and developed new brain imaging methods for studying the relationship between brain plasticity and learning. As the director of the Brain Development and Education Lab, the overarching goal of his research is to understand the mechanisms that underlie the process of learning to read, how these mechanisms differ in children with dyslexia, and to design literacy intervention programs that are effective across the wide spectrum of learning differences. Dr. Yeatman, welcome to Dyslexia Journey.
Great to be here. Listening to my intro, it makes me realize how hard it is having someone with joint appointments across many schools.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. Which maybe leads a little bit into the first question here. We just always like to find out, people's personal connection or how they ended up on their trajectory with this work. So how did you come to be interested in reading difficulties like dyslexia and end up on this career trajectory?
So I actually started my PhD with a deep interest in how experience sculpts brain development. So how a infant or a child's experience with the world, be it in school or just visual experience or auditory experience, how it actually shapes the development of the brain. And this is really a basic neuroscience question, right? It's a question about plasticity, about how the brain develops from intrinsic factors, then also how external factors shape that. And I initially got interested in reading as a tool to understand this, right? So a lot of what we know about brain plasticity comes from invasive studies in model organisms, in mice, in monkeys, in flies. And to study how experience shapes the human brain, you need a paradigm where you can change factors of the environment and measure how it impacts the brain. And reading is an incredible way to do that, right? This is this made up kind of arbitrary cultural invention of modern human societies. The idea of a literate society is, well, I don't know, arguably not something we've achieved, but best case, something that's quite new. Even 100 years ago, the idea of having a literate society wasn't the thing. And so now we can use that as a paradigm to understand how a child's experience with learning this brand new cognitive function actually sculpts the development of their brain. Now, as I started working my PhD on those basic scientific questions, I also realized, reading is also one of the most interesting things the brain does. It requires the integration of visual information, auditory information, language information. So it's also a way to understand brain connectivity. And also, it's really, really important in modern society, which I think is the reason you guys invited me here, is probably that third part, which I know is part of your journey in creating this podcast. And so it really started off from the basic neuroscience perspective, but through the course of my PhD and then the last decade plus of being a professor, we've moved more and more in the applied direction. So trying to take basic scientific insights and bring them to schools in useful ways.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that really leads into the next question, which is, can you tell us about the rapid online assessment of reading?
Yeah. So this started. So I'll give you a little bit of a history that you didn't ask for, but hey, I'm here.
I think it's interesting
So,
how these develop.
my lab has always done open source software work. We've been kind of at the forefront of the open science movement of trying to develop tools that are openly used. So rather than creating a proprietary thing that just the grad students in my lab get to use, creating software packages that any scientist, any lab, anywhere in the world can use, and also making data public, de-identifying it. So you don't know the people in our studies, but making the data public too, so that scientists can query our findings in different ways. You might remember March of 2020. I don't know what your guys' life looked there. My life looked like I had moved from University of Washington to Stanford, so the lab was still kind of in the startup phase. We had a pretty large group. We had a large team. A lot of us are quite technical doing software stuff. And everything we do in the lab involves sitting one-on-one in a room with kids. And in March, suddenly that was no longer a possibility. So we were all at home, and we started looking for areas where we could innovate with the expertise we had. And so the first challenge we decided to tackle was how do you assess reading skills when you can no longer sit in a small room and deliver individually administered, expertly scored assessments to kids. So that was the birth of Roar. It was the idea was, can we build, gamified web apps that tap into the mechanisms we know that are involved in reading, and make those scalable and automated so we can continue our research. And, so we published some papers on this, but it quickly became clear that us continuing our research was not the most important use case of these new tools. So from there, we started partnering with local schools, and then we started partnering with more schools, and then we grew an engineering team, and zoom forward however many years we are now past that period that many of us would like to forget. And Roar has grown into a full-featured platform that has not just assessments of single-word reading, but the whole suite of skills that contribute to differences in reading and math as well. And it's integrated with the major student identification systems that are used around schools, so it can be deployed automatically, not just for one of my research studies, but across a whole school district to assess the whole district in 20 minutes.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear. Well, did you have a follow-up first?
So you have integrations with like ClassLink and those kind of
ClassLink and Clever. Yeah, ClassLink, Clever, Google Single Sign-On. There's more that are coming. Unfortunately, the original idea of all these single sign-ons is that it would be a one-stop shop, but then it was so popular that now there's competition there, which means that we get to continue engineering more integrations.
Right, that's true. I'm curious with Roar, just trying to get that picture from the side of, let's say, the school or the teacher. Like, how would that feel for what the information they're getting? Like, what kinds of information would they get? Would it sort of be a pretty general assessment? Would it go pretty specific, like pretty, very, very specific on a particular, skill that a student's struggling with? How would that look?
Yeah, well, there's a couple different use cases. So we were just, and I'm quite proud of this, we were just approved as a official screener for reading difficulties in the state of California. And then more recently in the state of Ohio and the state of Minnesota as well. So there is now 42 states that have legislation requiring universal screening for reading difficulties. And I think this is will reach home for you guys, because I know that's something you guys think about a lot, right? It's like the early screening, early identification. So Roar's been approved as an official screener for a number of states. What this looks like, so when you're screening, what you want is the quickest, kind of lowest cost, most efficient way to flag who's at risk for struggles, right? Who's currently struggling and likely to continue struggling if they don't get additional support. So in that case, that's that use case would be a district running Roar at the beginning of the year, actually usually like beginning, middle, end of the year, 3 times a year, and all their students running the quick 15 to 20-minute screening version, which will flag students who need additional support in foundational reading skills. And it'll also give details about some specific areas. So whether there are specific challenges in phonological awareness, for example, or whether the kindergarten or first grade student has mastered all the letter sound correspondences. So that type of information.
Okay. So
additionally, so those are like kind of our core measures that are used as a screener. But we have another dozen or so measures that really provide a deeper dive. So we have measures that look at morphology, written vocabulary, spoken vocabulary, syntax, right? So your ability to understand grammatical structures in spoken English or Spanish or German or Portuguese, actually. We have row across a number of different languages, and we'll provide and reading comprehension skills. So you can kind of think of this as like assessing all the different aspects of reading, and we group these measures into different suites of measures. We have the foundational reading skills suite, which is typically used as a screener. And then we have these more detailed measures that provide kind of deep dives into different actionable skills.
Oh, that's really interesting. So our daughter, who we've talked about many times on the show, has dyslexia, and it took a while to get her identified. And I think one of the reasons is because she has surface dyslexia, as opposed to, I think, the more traditional orthographic dyslexia, I think it's called. Is that a distinction that Roar is able to detect?
Those aren't distinctions that I make per se.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective on that, actually.
One of the challenges in diagnosis is that there isn't a real gold standard. And this is one of the challenges also that we're hoping to solve. So I'm going to tell a story, and maybe this is your story. This is the story of many, many hundreds of families that have come through my lab over the years, which is kids start school, parents are very involved, and start to notice that, or start to notice concerns, but often don't get any information back from the school on that. Over years, these concerns grow. Maybe now it's second grade or third grade even. And at some point, families, particularly the ones that have the economic resources themselves, start pursuing a private practice neuropsychologist for a diagnosis, right? And just pausing there for 1 second, right, is the amount of privilege and resources it takes just to have that information, right? To have the amount of time and capacity to be involved enough in your kids' day-to-day education to notice yourself that things aren't on track, to have the knowledge that there's professionals that can help with this, and then also to have the resources. I don't know what it costs. I think you guys are in Colorado. I've been in Bay Area and Seattle, and it's many thousands of dollars to get a professional to give a diagnosis.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we did. We went to a private neuropsychologist for a day and a half, 2 days of testing, for thousands of dollars.
Yeah, right. And this, and then you guys, and I'm sure you probably talked with them. You were deeply interested and involved. This is one barrier that we hope to lift for Roar, right? That story is the story of hundreds of families that come through my lab for studies on dyslexia. And we want to democratize access to high quality data. It shouldn't require, and often the story goes with one of the parents left work to support their kid. I don't know if that's your guys' story too, but that's another common story, right? Turns out most families in the U.S. don't have the resources to be well, I'm going to stop working to support my kid because we're not getting the information needed. So that's one of our first goals, is democratizing access to data. And the other part, so this was my long answer to your simple question about different forms of dyslexia. It's not a standardized industry. So depending on which neuropsychologist you go to, they're going to give a different suite of tests, and they're going to write up their own interpretation of these tests, and they're professionals. It's no discredit to any individual, but they come in with their own knowledge base and opinions and interpretation of based on their own practice, which is great, right? That's what beyond following like guidelines of practice, like skilled clinicians should bring their own knowledge to it. But it also creates like in a world where getting services for dyslexia is so hard in itself, that the fact that there isn't like a standard definition, a standard set of tests, a standard agreed upon diagnosis as an additional challenge. So those are two things. I talked about the school side of ROAR, and that is one side of like having universal screeners. But as you mentioned up front, I have a joint appointment with the School of Medicine, and one of our hopes is to sync up all these different areas, to sync up the having high quality, universal, and free assessments in schools. Also syncing these up with clinical practice. So we have a project in our developmental behavioral pediatrics clinic. We're starting to use ROAR as a universal screener for kids coming into the clinic, so that clinicians, when a kid shows up, regardless of the reason, whether it's a concern about ADHD or anxiety, which are also two things that go along with dyslexia a lot, even if it's not a concern for reading, that clinician like has the same information for every student coming in. And then the third area is trying to democratize access to data by launching ROAR at Home, which will be our parent portal where parents can sign their kids up. Should say it is a research study, so everything we do, I'm at a university, everything we do is also for research purposes. So if a parent checks out our website and signs up, you'll see a consent form that talks about how we ensure data security and the types of research questions that will be addressed with the data. So it is, it's not just a free tool; it's a free tool and a research partnership. But we want to basically be able to provide all the same information to parents, to clinicians, to schools.
Yeah, and following this sort of adds on, I think, to what you were just talking about the clinician, aspect and all of that. Like, but also from the teacher's perspective, like what, and this maybe is individualized, but what do you see as the next steps? Let's say that a kid is identified as having reading difficulties. Like, what would happen next? Would that mean needing further diagnosis? Would it, presumably it would give the teacher some information for specific things to work on also. But because, this diagnosis is a piece of the whole thing because of accommodations and all of that, like, I'm curious about how all that, as you can see it play out, is there sort of a typical way that plays out for a particular kid?
There's not a typical way because it's so dependent on the specific school, the specific school district, the specific state, and then intersects with a number of things like the resources to the school, right? And I'm going to try not to go on a tangent about how our country has decided to organize our educational system, but based on the zip code you live in, the services that your kid is likely to get vary dramatically. And, I'm sure you guys are aware of the various reasons for that, right?
Yes.
So I think about this in a different way, is that diagnoses are only important because we have decided that they are a gateway to services.
Yes.
But they're also only a gateway to services usually in affluent communities, in many schools that don't have the resources to provide resources. Diagnosis. Kids often don't get diagnoses at all, and the diagnoses don't come with the same levels of support. So when we're working with schools, what we're trying to do is help them implement an effective multi-tiered system of support, rather than thinking about like a diagnosis and triaging a kid to like a specific intervention program. Instead, what we would like to see in every school is universal screening, and students that are flagged for needing additional support start getting a little bit of additional support in their classroom. Maybe additional small group instruction to focus on the skills that they're struggling with, and then you continue to screen over the course of the year. And some students just needed a little additional support, particularly young ones, right? Kids come in with such vastly different experiences that the early years of school should be there to support the children's reading skills regardless of their background.
Right.
But many students need more targeted support, right? So that's when you then should schools should move kids up to, one-on-one or have time with a reading specialist. And then, yes, often like at some point, that kid might need a diagnosis and then like a more intensive intervention, right? But that's the idea with the school system, is using a automated tool like ROAR to build an effective multi-tiered system of support around the data, right? And so it's not just a teacher giving like a little nudge. It shouldn't be that individual teacher's job to build the system. It's like the support around that teacher.
It sounds like it's really, it's trying to systematize and normalize this early screening and this continual screening in a way that it hasn't been true thus far.
Yeah, exactly. And then, that's like the kind of the different assessment suites in ROARs is actually many of the schools we're working with now are actually using the full suite of measures. So rather than just doing the quick 15-minute screener, they will universally run the whole suite of measures to have comprehension data, have data on vocabulary, have assessments across languages to provide a more detailed profile of each student's strengths and weaknesses. And that data can then be used to like think about teaching practices and how instruction can be individualized to every student.
And is that full suite also can be done completely independently by the student?
Yep. Yeah. Everything. And that's like one of the parts of ROAR. Everything's totally automated. So the idea is, you log in. If you're a little kid in a school, you log in with a QR code usually. So you don't have to remember passwords and usernames. It takes you right into, a map of the games. Kids play the games. The games have been predetermined by the district. So it's not up to the kid to be like, do I want to be assessed in phonological awareness today? Right. They just get led through the journey through the different games. And the teachers get the score reports in real time. So because it's totally automated, when if I think you guys are Denver, you said if Denver Public Schools decided to adopt ROAR, in that 30-minute block where the students are on their Chromebooks taking the test, the teacher could be there looking at the score reports in real time and seeing the students grouped into instructional groups.
Interesting. A couple other questions I thought of. One is, have you had any? So there's always this sort of we always tend to caveat this, like all teachers and schools are very well intentioned, right? But as you've mentioned, they're often very short of resources, and because of that, there's been some pushback on universal screening from teachers unions and things like that. Have you seen any pushback about this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, people push back for a variety of reasons, and screening on its own won't solve any problems if there isn't a effective multi-tiered system of support built around the data, right? So, I guess screening on its own actually does do something for high resource families. So in California, for example, schools are required to send home score reports to parents so that parents are informed. And so that means that schools ideally have an effective multi-tiered system of support, but they don't, and parents can step in on their own. But then, of course, that just stratifies based on income. So who can afford to purchase services on the free market. I think this is a huge challenge. I don't have the solution. I think it's an area where we probably need broader reform of our systems, where just requiring screening, is only as effective as the system's response to that screening. So not the individual teacher, right? It can't be the expectation of every teacher to retool themselves as a dyslexia specialist. That's not unless the district is providing the resources and time off for professional development, and which means that the state or the federal government is paying those costs, right? These are like real costs of people's time. I sympathize with that perspective, but I am also of the perspective that without data to highlight the problems are easy to ignore. So actually, when we're working with districts, we're often trying to get them to go beyond just complying with the legislation. So California requires screening in grades K1-2. ROAR is validated grades K-12. And the schools we prioritize working with are the ones that actually want to adopt ROAR K to 12, or at least K to 9. 9 is actually a good grade because there's a lot of students that still have struggles in high school, and their struggles are due to actionable challenges with foundational reading skills. That's my ideal scenario, is actually like implementing this universally through the upper grades.
Yeah.
So the data's there.
Yeah. Go ahead. First.
I was going to say, I was
Lots
going
of
to change
questions.
topics to the research and validation.
Well, okay, I do want to talk about that
Yeah.
next too, but since you just spoke about the older kids, I was watching some of the informational videos on your website, and I noticed that there was some talk about that. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, how ROAR can be important for the older kids. Of course, the early screening is so essential that a lot of people we don't standardly really have right now. So that's really, really key. But how do you find it extra useful for the older students?
Yeah, well, decoding skills are a bottleneck for everything, right? If you are a ninth grader who's still slowly struggling through decoding words, slowly and effortfully reading sentences, how can you be expected to, go home, read a book, write a book report, right? Or even, do math problems, which are more and more word problems, right? That have complex syntax and often long multisyllabic words like trigonometry or thinking back to my high school Pythagorean, right? Like reading is important for everything. And so ninth graders, come into high school, teachers have very little information on their students, and schools, most in high school, usually there are state accountability tests. And so schools are aware of the students that aren't meeting standards on those tests. Those tests, are summative, try to encompass, all the skills or all the knowledge that students should have relative to some predetermined state standards. And schools know that which students aren't meeting these standards, but they don't know why. And that's where ROAR can come in, because if you're not meeting the standards because this is often the assumption, like you don't have enough background knowledge. You just need more focus on different areas of curriculum, or you need a larger vocabulary potential. You don't understand some of the words. Like these are areas that high schools are well equipped to intervene and support students. But a lot of students, it's because they haven't mastered foundational reading skills, right? And so that means that all these interventions likely aren't going to be effective because they're not targeting the root of the problem. So many of the schools we work with implement universal screening up through ninth grade. Because this is, ninth grade is when students are entering high school, teachers have very little information on them, and that will flag the students that need additional support in foundational reading skills.
Okay, interesting. I was curious about the validation aspect, since you said earlier that there is kind of no gold standard for diagnosis. I'm curious how, sort of methodologically, how you went about validating ROAR.
Yeah, so validity is we often think about it as like, is it valid or not? But the way we should think about it is, is it valid for what? Right? Which is a question of like, what does this instrument like reliably tap into? And so these studies often start off with like small lab studies where we have a hypothesis about a new task that can tap into, for example, single word reading skills. And there's a variety of different widely used measures. So I'm guessing your daughter probably was administered the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. Yeah, okay, got it. Yeah, right. So that's one that's just widely used. Everyone knows how to interpret it. It's been developed and validated over many years as and is a part of dyslexia diagnosis. And so we started off with a small lab study where we had students take the first version of ROAR. We individually administered them the Woodcock-Johnson. We look at the correlation. It's quite high. It's like above 0.9. Then we go through and systematically start expanding this, like making more efficient, more reliable, and then running larger scale validation studies. Often the Woodcock-Johnson was our target for our single word reading measure, but we'd also, in our partnerships with school districts, ask them what measures they're already using. And so there's a whole suite of different measures that are used in schools, and If you go into the long and extensive Roar technical manual, you can see validation studies, starting off with relatively small, detailed lab studies, then going to larger studies with schools where Roar's just used standard of practice. So there's some schools that have been using Roar 3 times a year and are interested in partnering with us on a validation study. We're actually running a large one right now, looking at predictive validity over like a 2-year time frame. Where the school has been using Roar universally in grades K1-2 for 2 years now. My team's coming in. Actually, my whole team is there right now, working individually with students and individually administering these outcome measures to look at the predictive relationship between Roar and future assessment scores. And we're also then looking at the other assessments the school uses. Sometimes this is like state tests too. So in the case of middle school and high school, actually just published last night an article in the Roar technical manual looking at how single word reading predicts performance on these long multi-day summative state assessments. And the takeaway there is that students below a certain threshold, it's been referred to as the decoding threshold, basically students whose decoding skills are quite low for a middle school or high school student, almost all of these students are not meeting state standards too. So we can look at the predictive relationship in a number of different ways and build up a case that Roar is valid for X.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm curious also about, you mentioned, of course, the at-home Roar. So this is part of it, but maybe even wider down the line, thinking really big here. Like, what are your hopes and dreams for the trajectory of all of this?
My high level, so we've decided to keep Roar as a program run out of Stanford University.
Mm-hmm.
And my high-level vision is to see deeper systemic relationships between research and practice. I want to re-envision academia's role in society and society's relationship to academia. And education is just one place for this, right? There are brilliant researchers in every domain. And often we find ourselves addressing academic challenges, talking to our academic colleagues, but not in conversation with society. And I see this as an incredible opportunity to create that pipeline, and not just a one-way street, not just a way to get research to the world, but to make sure that the research questions we're thinking about are grounded in the lived experience of students, of teachers, of administrators, of communities, because that makes our research so much richer. Right? I mentioned publishing an article in the Roar Technical Manual last night. It's one I was working on over the weekend. And the data reflects students from all around the country. It's not just a study of struggling high school students in Palo Alto, the community around Stanford University. It's a study of struggling high school students. I won't name the districts. We keep our district partners, it's up to them whether they want to be named. Some of them like to be named in our writing, others don't. But the students in that really reflect the true diversity of learners around the United States, and diversity in the broadest sense. The educational experiences of a student in Ohio versus Minnesota versus California versus Louisiana is quite different. We want to make sure that our research reflects that, and that the benefits of our research are also distributed around the country. That's not just a benefit to the community that is right around the university.
Yeah, that's a wonderful vision. Yeah. For our listeners who are interested in using Roar at home, what's the best, do you have like a website that's sort of the central hub for everything?
Yeah, we do. And maybe you guys have show notes that you can put the link in. So it's roar.stanford.edu/sign up. That'll take you to the page that lists our current research studies. So every time you're signing up for Roar at Home, you are signing up to be part of a research study, and you can click the link, create accounts for your kids and yourself, and start using it. You get score reports in real time, or not in real time, because as your kid finishes the assessments, and you can use it multiple times over the year. And we plan to. This is like just the release of this tool, but then to also offer opportunities to participate in different kinds of research studies through Roar at Home. So the first thing that'll be up is kind of our access to our basic assessment suite, and then with kind of a couple additional new measures that we're just starting to validate, built into that. But we have another upcoming study of a online AI-based tool for tutoring students in reading fluency. And that'll be another research study that we'll be inviting Roar at Home users to join. Maybe your kid wants to join.
Yeah, that's great.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I can really see this as becoming, because so often with parents who have kids who are worried about their reading difficulties, I mean, this is a fantastic first place to point them. I feel like Roar at Home. Like, okay, you're worried? Like, go have your kid do this 20-minute assessment. Like, this is amazing.
Yeah, that's the hope. That's the hope. The worry though is that we're going to have a lot of frustrated families who then email us and want additional information, want services, want us to be a service organization, which we're not. And that's going to be a challenge for us. We're going to have a lot of frustrated families who wish I responded to every email I got, but unfortunately I can't. But hopefully, there's a broader understanding that we're all doing what we can.
Right, exactly.
Sure.
But this is so important, this screening.
Yeah.
I mean, because really, the accessibility of what you're doing, particularly the validity, obviously, but the accessibility, I think, is so key and really is something that's so needed. So
yeah, because it's just for so many parents, it is really something is not quite right, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I just mean that your child is not learning to read at the same speed as other children, and to provide just a gut check of okay, we could just go to this assessment and validate this is true.
Yeah, and contribute to the research space while you're doing that.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you so much for the work you're doing. It's so important. And we really appreciate you sharing all of this here with us today.
Great to chat.